At 70, Elias wakes before the light has fully committed to the day. There is a moment thin as onion skin when he does not know where he is. The room is charcoal gray, the air cool against the inside of his nostrils. Then the house speaks in its familiar language, a settling beam, the soft cough of pipes, the refrigerator's low, stubborn hum. His body answers with its own inventory. Knees intact. Lungs drawing air without a hitch. Heart steady as a metronome. He fluxes his hands beneath the quilt. The quilt is an old one, blue squares faded to the color of a summer sky seen through memory. His fingers press into the cotton, and he feels strength, their tendons rising like cables beneath the skin. The hands are roped with veins now, the knuckles knotted and a little enlarged, but they close into fists with a certainty that still surprises him. He opens them again, slowly, testing the hinge of each finger. He used to wake and count his losses. Now he counts what answers back. He swings his legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor receives his feet without complaint. There was a time when he braced for dizziness, for the tilt and blackening at the edges of his vision. Now he stands in one motion. He waits, out of habit. The world holds. Good, he murmurs, not to anyone in particular. The kitchen smells faintly of last night's basil and dish soap. He moves through it without turning on the overhead lights. Dawn is already fingering the window above the sink, a diluted gold that lays itself across the counter. He fills the kettle and sets it on the stove. The click of the burner igniting is sharp and intimate, a small promise of heat. On a shelf above the sink sits a chipped teacup he has had for 30 years. White porcelain, a thin blue rim, a crack running like a hairline fracture from lip to handle. He never threw it away. He runs his thumb along the crack now, the way he has done 1,000 times, feeling the slight ridge where the glaze once split under heat. He used to think of it as damaged. Now he thinks of it as honest. The kettle begins its low growl. Elias scoops coffee grounds into the French press 2 heaping spoonfuls, dark and fragrant. The smell rises immediately, rich and bitter, cutting through the kitchen like a blade. He inhales deeply, letting it settle behind his eyes. He did not drink coffee during the long months of treatment. The taste turned metallic in his mouth. Even the smell, once a morning comfort, had made him nauseous. No, it is a flag planted unconquered territory. When the water boils, he pours it slowly. Steam unfurls, fogging the window for a moment. Outside, the garden is still shadowed. The apple tree stands in its corner, branches bare now in late autumn, but the memory of blossoms already flickers at the edge of his mind. He presses the plunger down, slow and deliberate. From the hallway comes a sudden eruption of small footsteps. Da-da, a voice calls, bright and reckless. Elias's mouth curves before he can stop it. 2 grandchildren burst into the kitchen like weather, Lena with her wild braid coming undone, Mateo clutching a wooden dinosaur by the tail. They smell of sleep and soap and something sweet, like the inside of a cupboard where cookies have been kept. Not so loud, Elias says, though there is no reprimand in it. The sun hasn't finished waking up. It's up, Lena insists, climbing onto a chair without invitation. I saw it. Mateo wraps his arms around Elias's waist, his cheek pressing into the soft cotton of Elias's shirt. The contact is sudden and fierce. Elias feels the heat of the boy's face. Through the fabric. He rests a hand on the small, solid back. There was a time when he wondered if he would live long enough to memorize the weight of this child. He pours coffee into the chipped cup. The liquid is dark as turned earth. He takes a careful sip. It is strong. It is good. It stays down. Can we go to the garden? Lena asks. After breakfast, Elias says. He moves around the kitchen with a steadiness that still feels like a private miracle. He cracks eggs into a bowl, the shells giving way with a familiar, delicate resistance. He beats them with a fork, watching the yolks dissolve into a uniform gold. The fork taps against ceramic in a small, rhythmic clink. His daughter, Miriam, appears in the doorway, tying her hair back. There are threads of silver in it now. He notices them the way he notices the weather without alarm. "You're up early," she says. "So are you." She watches him for a second longer than necessary. He knows that look. It is a habit she has not yet unlearned: the quiet checking, the inventory of his color, his posture, the steadiness of his hands. "I'm fine," he says gently. "I know," she replies. But her eyes soften, as if fine is a fragile word. They eat together at the wooden table scarred with years of use. The children argue over the last slice of toast. Butter smears across Mateo's chin. Sunlight finally breaks free of the horizon and spills fully into the room, turning the steam from Elias's coffee into something almost visible, a ghost rising and disappearing. He watches the light touch the apple tree outside. The bark is rough, fissured, alive. There was a winter when he believed he would not see that tree bloom again. He sets his cup down carefully. The crack in the porcelain catches the light. The memory arrives without warning, as memories often do, not with drama, but with a shift in temperature. The hospital had smelled of antiseptic and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit hidden somewhere out of sight. Elias remembers the pattern of the floor tiles, pale gray squares interrupted by darker ones in a grid that seemed to stretch on forever. He had followed those tiles down the corridor, the rubber soles of his shoes whispering against them. The oncology wing was quieter than the rest of the hospital. Not peaceful, just subdued. Conversations happened in lowered voices, as if volume itself might be contagious. A nurse with a tight butt and careful eyes had led him into a consultation room. The chair he sat in was molded plastic, faintly warm from the previous occupant. There was a painting on the wall, a field of abstract flowers, too bright to be believable. He had not been afraid yet. He had been irritated. It had started with fatigue, a heaviness in his bones that sleep did not fix. Then the weight loss, subtle at first, a notch tighter on his belt. Miriam had insisted on tests. "Just to be safe," she'd said, her hand resting on his arm longer than necessary. He had rolled his eyes. "I'm 70, not porcelain." No, we sat across from Dr. Khanna, a man in his 40s with tired kindness etched into the corners of his mouth. The doctor's desk was cluttered with files. Elias noticed the edge of one folder bent upward, the paper inside slightly askew. Details anchored him. Dr. Khanna folded his hands together, unfolded them, adjusted his glasses. "I'm afraid the results are not what we hoped for," he began. Elias remembers the way the air seemed to thicken around the words. "Stage 4, the doctor said later, carefully, as if handling a fragile object. "It has metastasized." Metastasized. A word that sounded like something foreign and invasive. He pictured roots, thin and white, threading through soil. "We'll start treatment immediately," Dr. Khanna continued. "Aggressive. We'll do everything we can." "Everything we can." Elias nodded as if they were discussing plumbing repairs. He asked practical questions. "What are the options? What are the side effects? How long?" How long hung in the air between them. "It's difficult to say," the doctor replied. Statistically, Elias held up a hand. "Don't give me statistics," he said quietly. "Give me what you've seen." Dr. Khanna paused. "I've seen people surprise us," he said. "And I've seen," he stopped. Cleared his throat. "This is serious. Serious." Outside the consultation room, the hospital continued its indifferent rhythm. A card rattled past. A phone rang somewhere down the hall. Elias felt as though he had stepped slightly out of sync with the world. When he stood to leave, his knees felt unfamiliar. The door handle was cool against his palm. He walked back down the corridor, the grid of tiles stretching before him like a code he could not decipher. In the parking lot, the sky was a flat, unremarkable blue. He sat in his car and placed both hands on the steering wheel. They looked the same as they always had, broad, capable, marked with small scars from decades of work. He turned them over, studying the creases. Stage 4. He waited for panic. Instead, there was a strange, suspended quiet. As if the world had taken a breath and not yet decided whether to exhale. He drove home. Miriam was in the kitchen when he entered, chopping carrots with unnecessary force. She looked up immediately. "Well?" she asked. He set his keys down with deliberate care. "It's cancer," he said. The knife slipped in her hand. A thin slice of carrot skidded off the cutting board and landed on the floor. "What stage?" Her voice was already thinning. 4. She stared at him, as if waiting for him to laugh, to correct himself. That's the last one," she whispered. "Yes." "What?" He remembers how quickly the house filled after that. Phone calls. His sister arriving. With the casserole no one touched. Neighbors hovering in the doorway with expressions that tried to be brave and failed. "I'm so sorry," they kept saying. He found himself nodding, accepting condolences for a death that had not yet occurred. In the days that followed, the house took on a different atmosphere. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Miriam's eyes were red-rimmed in the mornings. He caught her once in the hallway, pressing her forehead against the wall as if bracing against impact. "I'm still here," he had said. "I know," she replied too quickly. Friends called at first. Long, earnest conversations about treatment plans and second opinions. Promises to visit. Then, gradually, the calls thinned. One friend, Thomas, who had shared fishing trips and decades of small confidences, left a voicemail heavy with forced cheer. "You're a fighter, Ela. You've got this." They never managed to schedule a visit. Another sent a card. The handwriting wavered across the page, "Thinking of you in this difficult time." No return address. Elias began to notice the small hesitations. Invitations that did not arrive. Conversations that skirted around the word cancer as if it might leap across the table and infect the speaker. He would enter a cafe and see someone he knew glance up, recognition flashing across their face followed by something else. A tightening. A calculation. Sometimes they waved. Sometimes they looked back down at their phones. He became, slowly, a rehearsal for grief. At church, Mrs. Alvarez clasped his hands in both of hers and held on too long. "We're praying for a miracle," she said, her eyes glossy. He wanted to tell her he was not a miracle. He was a man with a disease. Treatment began on a gray morning that felt borrowed from someone else's life. The chemotherapy room was lined with recliners upholstered in a pattern that tried too hard to be cheerful: blue swirls and green leaves. 4 poles stood like metal sentinels beside each chair. A nurse draped a thin blanket over his legs. The fabric of the hospital gown against his back was coarse, open in a way that made him feel exposed to more than just the air. "This might make you feel cold," she said, adjusting the line. The first drop of medication slid into his vein with deceptive gentleness. He watched it enter the tube, a clear liquid, almost innocent. He wondered how something so transparent could be so violent. Across from him, a woman in a red scarf stared at the ceiling. Their eyes met briefly. There was recognition there, but no introduction. They were members of a club no one wanted to join. Hours later, he walked out of the hospital feeling as though something fundamental had shifted inside him. The world looked the same. The sky was still gray. Cars still moved along the street. But he carried a new interior weight, a knowledge that had burrowed deep. At home, he tried to eat. The soup Miriam placed before him smelled faintly metallic. He took a spoonful and forced himself to swallow. "How is it?" she asked. "Fine," he lied. That night, lying in bed, he felt the first true wave of nausea crest and break. He made it to the bathroom just in time. His reflection in the mirror afterward startled him, skin pale, eyes already shadowed. He gripped the edge of the sink. "So this is how it begins," he said to the empty room. In the weeks that followed, his body became unfamiliar territory. Food turned against him. Sleep fractured into thin, restless segments. His hair began to loosen its hold, strands collecting on his pillow like evidence. He would wake in the early hours and listen to the house breathing around him. The refrigerator's hum, the distant creak of wood contracting in the cold. He felt suspended between two versions of himself, the man who had walked confidently through his days and the man whose strength now seemed negotiable. One afternoon, he found himself alone in the living room. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a diluted light. On the coffee table lay a stack of sympathy cards, their envelopes already opened. He picked one up at random. "We're here for you, always." He set it back down. The phone had not rung in 3 days. He did not blame them, not entirely. Illness has a gravitational pull. It warps conversations. It demands a vocabulary most people do not possess. Still, he felt the quiet absences like small, precise cuts. He began to understand the sterile silence of the hospital not as an anomaly, but as a preview. The world, he realized, does not know what to do with someone who might be dying. And so it begins to practice letting him go. The house grew quieter as the weeks went on. Not the natural quiet of a resting place, but a careful one. A padded quiet. Miriam moved through rooms as though carrying a bowl filled to the brim, afraid of spilling something invisible. Doors closed softly. The television volume remained low. Even the children, when they visited, were hushed in the hallway before entering his room. "Dawn is sleeping," Miriam would whisper. He was not always sleeping. Sometimes he lay with his eyes open, studying the thin crack in the ceiling paint above his bed. It ran in a crooked line from one corner to the light fixture, branching near the end like a river delta. He traced it with his gaze over and over, mapping it, memorizing its turns. The bed had been moved to the living room for easier access. He had resisted at first. "I'm not an invalid," he had said. "It's just temporary," Miriam replied, not meeting his eyes. Temporary. The word hovered like a fragile bridge. Visitors came in the beginning. Casseroles again. Bouquets that shed petals onto the coffee table. They stood around his recliner with expressions that tried to be bright. "You look good," they said. He knew he did not. The chemotherapy had hollowed him out. His cheeks sank inward. His collarbones sharpened beneath his skin. When he ran a hand over his scalp and felt it smooth and foreign beneath his palm, he had laughed once a short, startled sound. Well, he told his reflection, less to comb. But in company, he felt the shift. Conversation skimmed the surface of weather and neighborhood news. No one asked what it felt like when the medication burned its way into his veins. No one asked about the nights. They spoke around the crater. Thomas came once. He stood near the doorway, hat in hand, as if unsure whether he was permitted to enter. "You're a sight," Thomas said, attempting humor. His eyes flicked quickly over Elias's gaunt frame and away. "I've been worse," Elias replied. They sat in silence longer than they ever had before. The air thickened between them, filled with unsaid things, fishing trips postponed, jokes left unfinished, the possibility that there would be no more summers. "Well," Thomas said finally, rising too soon. You rest. Don't you worry about anything. After he left, Elias watched through the window as his old friend paused at the end of the walkway, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against a wind that was not there. Thomas did not come again. The phone rang less and less. Messages grew shorter. Eventually, days passed without interruption. He found himself studying the calendar on the wall. Each square held its small promises, appointments, blood tests, treatment cycles. The rest of the days were blank, vast and white. He began to measure time differently, not in weeks, but in tolerances. How long he could stand before his legs trembled. How long he could hold down a mouthful of toast. How long he could endure the metallic taste that coated his tongue like a thin film of rust. The isolation was not loud. It did not announce itself with slammed doors or raised voices. It arrived in subtleties. A neighbor who crossed the street rather than risk an encounter. An acquaintance who sent a text instead of knocking. A relative who began sentences with, "When you're gone," and then corrected herself too late. He felt, at times, like a photograph already placed in a frame of mourning. One evening, he overheard Miriam in the kitchen. Her voice was low, tight. "Yes, the prognosis is poor," she said into the phone. "We're preparing. I don't want him to suffer." Preparing. He sat in his recliner, the thin blanket tucked around his legs, and stared at his hands. They rested on the armrests, light and unfamiliar. The veins stood out like pale blue threads. He flexed his fingers slowly. "I am still here," he thought. The thought did not rise in anger. It rose in disbelief. At the hospital, the isolation took on a different texture. The chemotherapy room hummed with machinery and quiet resignation. Patients arrived and departed like tides. Some chairs were occupied by the same faces week after week. Others emptied and remained so. He learned not to ask where someone had gone. A man named Harold had sat 2 seats down from him during the second cycle. Harold wore a navy cap pulled low over his thinning hair and spoke about his garden tomatoes the size of fists, he said, and a stubborn patch of zucchini that refused to die. "You've got to talk to them," Harold insisted, tapping his temple. "Plants listen." Elias had smiled faintly. The next week, Harold's chair was empty. The nurse avoided Elias's eyes when he glanced toward it. The silence there was sterile in a way that cut deeper than noise. Conversations were murmured, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft swish of wardrobes. The air smelled perpetually of antiseptic and warmed plastic. Once, as the medication slid into his vein, Elias felt an overwhelming urge to stand up and walk out. To tear the line from his arm and flee the room, the building, the diagnosis. Instead, he watched the clear liquid descend through the tube. His body responded with increasing rebellion. His skin grew sallow. His mouth filled with sores that made even water feel abrasive. He lost weight rapidly. His clothes hung from him as though borrowed from a larger man. One afternoon, attempting to walk from the living room to the bathroom without assistance, he found his legs buckling halfway down the hall. He caught himself against the wall, breath coming in shallow bursts. The hallway seemed longer than he remembered. He slid slowly to the floor, the coolness of the wood pressing against his cheek. From this angle, he could see the underside of the console table, a place no one ever cleaned. Dust had gathered there in small, patient clumps. He laughed once, softly. "So this is what it comes to," he thought. Studying dust. Miriam found him minutes later. "Dad?" Her voice cracked on the word. "I'm fine," he said automatically. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering before settling on his shoulders. "You can't do this alone." He did not answer. because he was already learning that aloneness had less to do with physical presence and more to do with the territory inside his own mind. The NATO did not announce itself with a single dramatic event. It arrived one night in late winter, disguised as another in a long procession of difficult evenings. The house was asleep. Wind pressed against the windows, a low, persistent moan. Elias lay awake, every joint aching as if packed with ground glass. The nausea had ebbed for the moment, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that refused to tip into rest. He stared at the red digits of the clock, 2:17 a.m. The room was dimly lit by a street lamp outside, its light filtering through the curtains in a diluted amber wash. Shadows ghouled in the corners. He tried to shift his position and felt a sharp, electric pain lance through his abdomen. His breath caught. For a moment, he saw nothing but white. "This is it," a voice inside him said, not panicked, not even particularly emotional, merely observational. He closed his eyes. The thought that followed was not of his own suffering. It was of release. How easy it would be, he realized, to stop fighting, to refuse the next treatment, to let the disease complete its quiet arithmetic. He imagined the relief on certain faces, relief disguised as grief. The end of uncertainty. The closing of a chapter already half written in their minds. The wind outside rose, rattling the glass. He turned his head slowly toward the window. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see the silhouette of the apple tree in the yard. Bare branches etched against the night sky, rigid and unadorned. He had planted that tree the year Miriam turned 10. She had insisted on digging part of the hole herself, dirt smeared across her cheeks like war paint. "It'll grow with me," she had declared. And it had. Each spring, it unfurled blossoms, small, defiant bursts of white and pink. Each autumn, it bent under the weight of fruit. No, it stood stripped, skeletal. He watched the branches sway under the force of the wind. "If I do not see it bloom again," he thought, "something inside me will remain unfinished." The thought was small. It did not carry the grand rhetoric of survival. It was not about legacy or courage or proving anything to anyone. It was about a tree. About the simple, stubborn desire to witness one more spring. He let his mind travel further. He pictured Lena's braid, perpetually coming undone. Mateo's small hand gripping his own. The chipped teacup in the kitchen, its crack catching morning light. "I am not done with these things," he realized. The pain pulsed again, insistent. He rolled onto his side with effort, curling slightly despite himself. Sweat cooled against his skin. His breath came shallow and uneven. "You can stop," the voice whispered again. He imagined stepping out of his body the way one steps out of a too-tight coat. Imagined the quiet that might follow. But alongside that image rose another, the apple tree in blossom, petals falling like soft confetti onto the grass. Miriam standing beneath it, looking up. He opened his eyes and fixed them on the faint outline of the branches. "Not yet," he said aloud. The words were barely audible, but they altered something inside him. A shift, subtle as a gear catching. Not yet. He did not feel brave. He felt stubborn. He reached for the small notebook Miriam had placed on the side table weeks earlier. "Write when you can," she had urged. His hand trembled as he opened it. The paper was lined, clean, waiting. Under the dim light, he wrote a single sentence, "I want to see the tree bloom." The letters were uneven, being pressing too hard into the page. But the sentence existed now outside his head. A declaration, however modest. He closed the notebook and let his hand rest atop it. The night stretched on. Pain ebbed and surged. Sleep came in fractured increments. But something had crystallized. In the days that followed, the battle became less abstract. He began to speak more directly with Dr. Cano. "What are my actual chances?" he asked during one appointment, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The doctor hesitated. "They are not high," he admitted. "But they are not zero." "Then we proceed," Elias said. There was no drama in the exchange. No swelling music. Just two men acknowledging a difficult truth. At home, he started insisting on small acts of agency. "I will walk to the mailbox," he told Miriam one afternoon. "It's too far," she protested. "It's 20 steps. It's icy. I'll hold the railing." He did not make it the full distance that day. His legs shook violently halfway down the path. But he stood there, gripping the cold metal of the railing, lungs burning, and looked toward the apple tree. The branches were still bare. Not yet, he reminded himself. Isolation remained. Friends did not suddenly return. The phone did not erupt with apologies. But the silence began to change in texture. It was no longer solely imposed from the outside. It became, in part, chosen. He stopped waiting for calls that did not come. Stopped rehearsing conversations in which he explained his condition gently, so as not to discomfort anyone. Instead, he narrowed his world to what remained tangible. The feel of the notebook beneath his palm. The slow, careful swallowing of broth that stayed down. The faint, almost imperceptible shift in the apple tree's buds as winter loosened its grip. One morning, weeks after that long night, he noticed the smallest swelling along a branch. A bud, tight and green, pushing against the bark. He stood at the window for a long time, watching it. It was nothing, really. A speck of promise against rough wood. But it was enough. Recovery did not arrive like a sunrise. It crept in sideways. At first, it was only the absence of something, the nausea that did not come one morning, the dizziness that receded a little faster than usual. Elias did not trust it. He had learned the body's capacity for betrayal. But the blood work shifted. Numbers that had once fallen like failing grades began to climb. Dr. Khanna adjusted his glasses, studying the chart with cautious interest. "There's improvement," he said. Improvement. The word felt fragile in the room, as if it might fracture under too much attention. "Is it temporary?" Elias asked. "Possibly," the doctor admitted. "But it's real." "Real?" Elias nodded once. He had stopped celebrating too soon. At home, the first milestone was so small it almost escaped notice. He woke one morning with a hunger that did not revolt him. Not a grand appetite, just a quiet, steady request. He shuffled into the kitchen, slower than before but upright, and toasted a slice of bread. The smell did not turn his stomach. He buttered it carefully, the knife scraping softly against the surface. When he took a bite, he waited for the familiar wave of nausea. It did not come. He swallowed. Then another bite. By the time he reached the crust, his eyes were wet. Miriam entered the kitchen and froze when she saw the empty plate. "You ate?" she asked, almost accusingly. "Yes." And it stayed. She pressed her hand to her mouth, laughter and something like relief colliding in her chest. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, careful but fierce. His body felt less like a battleground at morning and more like a fragile ally. The walks began again. At first, it was only to the mailbox, those 20 steps that had once seemed insurmountable. The railing was cold beneath his palm. His legs trembled, but they obeyed. He stood at the edge of the driveway and looked at the street as though reacquainting himself with a place he had once known intimately. The neighbor's dog barked from behind a fence. A car passed slowly, sunlight glinting off its windshield. The world had not paused during his absence. He walked back inside without collapsing. The next week, he made it to the apple tree. Up close, The bark was more textured than he remembered, deep grooves and ridges like the folds of an aging face. He placed his palm flat against it. The wood was cool, solid. The buds had opened. White blossoms freckled the branches, delicate and improbable. A breeze lifted a few petals, carrying them briefly before they settled on the grass. "I made it," he whispered. Not triumphantly. Simply as a fact. Recovery was grueling in its own way. Muscles that had withered under months of treatment protested each demand. He began with small repetitions, lifting a light dumbbell Miriam had found in the garage, walking laps around the living room, standing a little longer each day. His reflection in the mirror changed slowly. The hollows of his cheeks softened. A faint shadow of hair returned to his scalp, stubborn and uneven. His skin regained color, though it carried a new map of fine lines. He studied himself without flinching. "You are not who you were," he thought. "But you are." The concept of kintsugi came to him unexpectedly. He had once seen a documentary Japanese artisans repairing shattered pottery with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The cracks were not hidden. They were illuminated. Broken, then made more beautiful for having been broken. He thought of his own body that way. Of the scar where the port had been inserted. Of the veins that had carried poison meant to heal. Of the nights that had nearly undone him. The breaks were still visible. Perhaps that was the point. When Dr. Kanna finally said the word remission, it did not thunder. It settled gently between them. "There is no active disease detectable," the doctor explained. "We will continue to monitor closely." "No active disease," Elias repeated. The phrase felt clinical, almost sterile. It did not capture the magnitude of what had occurred. He walked out of the hospital that day without the weight he had carried in. The sky was an ordinary blue, but it seemed sharper somehow, edges more defined. In the parking lot, he paused before getting into his car. He placed both hands on the steering wheel. They looked older. Thinner than before the illness, perhaps. But steady. "Still here," he said. The confrontation did not happen all at once. It began with an invitation. Thomas called one afternoon, months into Elias's recovery. "Ela." The voice was hesitant, almost boyish. I heard you're doing better." "I am," Elias replied. A pause. "That's good. That's real good." Another pause, heavier. "Listen, some of us are meeting at the lake this weekend. Thought maybe you'd like to join. If you're up for it." The words were careful. Testing. Elias stood by the kitchen window as he listened. The apple tree outside was heavy with early fruit now, small green globes tucked among the leaves. "I won't be coming," he said calmly. "Oh." Thomas cleared his throat. Sure, I get it. You're still recovering." "That's not it." Silence expanded across the line. "When I was sick," Elias continued, "I needed friends. Not fishermen." Thomas inhaled sharply. "Eli, I don't say that to hurt you," Elias said. "But you disappeared. It was hard to see you like that," Thomas admitted, voice tight. "I didn't know what to say." "You could have said nothing," Elias replied. And sat there. The honesty surprised even him. There was no heat in it. No raised voice. Just clarity. "I was scared," Thomas said finally. "So was I." The admission hung between them. "I don't know how to fix that," Thomas added. "Neither do I," Elias said. "But pretending it didn't happen won't help." They did not resolve it neatly. There were no sweeping reconciliations. But something real had been spoken aloud, and that mattered. Other confrontations were quieter. At church, Mrs. Alvarez approached him again, hands clasped. "We prayed so hard," she said. eyes shining. God is good. Elias held her gaze. God was good when I was sick too, he said gently. Even when you all stopped visiting. Her fingers tightened around his. We didn't know how to help. You could have asked. She looked down, chastened. He did not intend to shame her. But he refused to let the narrative rewrite itself into something comfortable. With family, the reckoning was more intimate. One evening, after the children had gone home, Elias found Miriam in the kitchen, washing dishes with unnecessary force. You thought I was already gone, he said quietly. She froze, water running over her hands. I was preparing, she whispered. For what? For losing you. He stepped closer, leaning lightly against the counter. I understand fear, he said. But don't bury me before I'm dead. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I couldn't bear the idea of being unprepared, she admitted. I thought if I rehearsed it, it would hurt less. And did it? She shook her head. He reached out, placing his hand over hers in the soapy water. I was fighting, he said. I needed you fighting with me. Not grieving ahead of time. She nodded, swallowing hard. I'm sorry. I know. The boundaries he reestablished were not loud. They were firm. When acquaintances approached him with exaggerated admiration, "You're such an inspiration," he did not smile politely. I was sick, he would say. I did what I had to do. When someone joked awkwardly about him being on borrowed time, he responded evenly, we all are. He stopped attending gatherings where his illness became the centerpiece of conversation. He declined invitations that felt obligatory rather than sincere. He cultivated a smaller circle. Quality over volume. In the garden, he worked slowly but persistently. Pulling weeds, turning soil, tying young branches to stakes for support. The apple tree yielded its first harvest since his remission that autumn. He picked one carefully, turning it in his hand. Its skin was mottled red and green, imperfect. He bit into it. The crunch was sharp and immediate. Juice ran down his wrist. He laughed, startled by the intensity of flavor. He had never tasted an apple so vividly. Later, he placed the chipped teacup on the kitchen table and studied it again. The crack seemed more pronounced in the afternoon light. He traced it with his finger. If it had shattered completely, he might have discarded it. But it had endured, fracture and all. He considered, briefly, repairing it with gold lacquer, honoring the break rather than disguising it. Instead, he left it as it was. A reminder. The grandchildren returned often. They ran through the yard, shrieking with unfiltered joy. Elias chased them in short bursts, laughter catching in his chest. He tired more quickly than before, but the fatigue felt earned, not imposed. One evening, Lena sat beside him beneath the apple tree. Were you really that sick? She asked, serious beyond her years. Yes. Did you think you were going to die? He considered the question. Yes, he said. She leaned her head against his arm. But you didn't. No what? He looked up at the branches, now stripped again in the approach of winter. I wasn't finished, he replied. She accepted this as sufficient. As the months passed, Elias understood that survival was not a clean narrative. It did not erase the loneliness. It did not restore every relationship. Some people never returned. And that, too, became part of the gold in the cracks. He no longer measured his life by its length, but by its texture. The smell of morning coffee rising in steam. The weight of a child's hand in his own. The feel of bark beneath his palm. The quiet knowledge that he had stood at the edge of absence and chosen, stubbornly, to remain. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast long, honey-colored light across the garden, Elias sat alone beneath the apple tree. He closed his eyes and listened. Wind moving through leaves. Distant laughter from inside the house. His own breath, steady and unforced. He placed his hand against his chest, feeling the rhythm there. Not perfect. Not untouched. But whole in a way he had not understood before. By the time Elias turned 70, the story people told about him had hardened into something polished. They called him resilient. A fighter. A miracle. He let the words pass over him like weather. On the morning of his birthday, he wakes again before the light has committed to the sky. The house is still. The refrigerator hums. A pipe ticks softly in the wall. He lies there for a moment and performs the old inventory, not from fear now, but from gratitude sharpened by memory. Heart. Lungs. Hands. He raises one hand in the dimness and studies it. The veins are still raised, the skin thin as parchment. A faint scar marks the place where the port once rested beneath the surface. He presses it lightly, feeling the slight ridge. A seam. He sits up without assistance. The quill falls away. The wooden floor meets his feet. There is no drama in the act. That is the point. In the kitchen, the chipped teacup waits where it always has. White porcelain, blue rim, crack running from lip to handle like a fault line that refused to widen. Months ago, Miriam had brought him a small repair kit she'd found in a specialty shop, lacquer and powdered gold, a nod to the art he had once mentioned. You could fix it properly, she'd said. He had turned the box over in his hands, considering. Now the cup sits repaired. He did it himself one quiet afternoon. Mixed the lacquer slowly, stirred in the fine gold powder until it shimmered faintly. He traced the crack with deliberate care, filling the fracture rather than disguising it. The gold settled into the line, thin but luminous. The cup is no longer pretending to be whole. It is something else. He runs his thumb along the raised seam. It catches the early light, a delicate thread of brightness against white porcelain. The kettle begins its low growl. Coffee grounds bloom under hot water. Steam rises, fragrant and steady. When he pours the coffee, he watches how the gold seam glows briefly before the steam bails it. Footsteps thunder down the hallway. Da-da. He smiles before turning. Lena is taller now, braid thicker, less wild. Matteo follows, clutching not a dinosaur but a worn paperback book about constellations. They crash into him without hesitation. He absorbs the impact, laughing. Easy, he says. I'm still 70. You don't look 70, Matteo declares, examining him critically. What does 70 look like? Matteo considers. Wrinkly. Elias lifts an eyebrow. And I'm not. Not that much, Lena amends diplomatically. Miriam appears behind him, carrying a cake box from the bakery in town. She catches his eye and smiles in a way that still holds the faint echo of those long months, but the fear has thinned, replaced by something steadier. You ready for your party? She asks. He nods. The gathering is small by design. The living room fills with the scent of coffee and cinnamon. Sunlight slants through the windows, striking the apple tree outside. It is late spring again. Blossoms cling to the branches in quiet defiance of gravity. People arrive in twos and threes. Thomas stands awkwardly near the doorway, hat in hand as he had once before. But this time, he steps forward without waiting to be invited. You look solid, he says. I feel it, Elias replies. There is no embrace. No dramatic reconciliation. But they stand shoulder to shoulder near the window, watching the children chase each other through the yard. I was wrong, Thomas says quietly, eyes still on the glass. About disappearing. Elias nods once. I know. I won't do that again. Good, Elias says simply. The respect Elias commands now is not loud. It does not demand attention. It accumulates in small gestures. When he enters the cafe on Main Street, conversations do not stop in discomfort. They shift to make space. "How's the garden?" the barista asks, genuine curiosity in her voice. Stubborn as ever, Elias replies. At church, Mrs. Alvarez no longer clasps his hands in desperate prayer. Instead, she asks about his apple harvest, about the children, about the book he mentioned reading last week. He does not occupy the role of miracle anymore. He occupies the role of man. Later in the afternoon, after cake has been cut and plates stacked, Elias steps outside alone. The garden hums with bees moving lazily between blossoms. The air smells faintly sweet, tinged with soil. He walks to the apple tree. Its trunk has thickened over the years. The bark bears new scars where branches were pruned, where storms tested its structure. He places his palm against it, feeling the steady resistance of living wood. "I kept my promise," he murmurs. A breeze lifts the blossoms, scattering a few petals across the grass. One lands on his sleeve. He brushes it away gently. He thinks of the night when he nearly let go. The wind against the window. The clock's red digits. The notebook on the table. I want to see the tree blue. He has seen it bloom not once, but many times now. He has seen it bear fruit again and again. He has pruned it, tended it, leaned against it in exhaustion and in joy. He understands something now that he did not then. Survival is not a single decision made in the dark. It is a series of small, stubborn choices repeated in the light. Inside the house, laughter erupts. Someone has dropped a fork. A child shrieks with delight. Elias turns back toward the sound. He walks without hurry, but without hesitation. In the evening, when the guests have gone and the dishes are drying in their rack, he sits at the kitchen table with the chip cup before him. The gold seam glints under the overhead light. Miriam sits across from him, elbows on the table. "You know," she says, "people talk about you." He smiles faintly. "I hope not too much. They say you're different." "How?" She searches for the word. "Calmer," she says. "Stronger. Not in the obvious way. Just solid." He considers this. "I was broken," he says. She starts to protest, but he licks a hand gently. "No, let me finish. I was broken. And I saw the cracks clearly. Most people spend their lives pretending they don't have any." She looks at the cup, following his gaze to the gold seam. "You fill yours with gold," she says softly. "I didn't fill them," he corrects. "I accepted them." There is a difference. The respect he feels now from others, from himself, is not rooted in survival alone. It is rooted in that acceptance. In the refusal to hide the fractures. He no longer chases what exhausts him. He declines what diminishes him. He speaks plainly when something matters. Silence, when chosen, is no longer imposed isolation but deliberate space. Later, in his bedroom, he undresses slowly. The scar on his chest catches his eye in the mirror. He traces it without flinching. "Still here," he says again. He slides beneath the quilt. The house settles around him. Pipe stick. Wood creaks. The refrigerator hums its patient note. He does not perform the inventory tonight. He simply breathes. Outside, the apple tree stands in the dark, blossoms pale against the night sky. It will lose them soon. Fruit will come. Then leaves will fall. Then winter. He is not naive about cycles anymore. He knows the body will one day fail for reasons unrelated to cancer. He knows time is not negotiable. But he also knows this: he met the fracture and did not look away. Morning will come again. Coffee will bloom under hot water. Small feet will thunder down the hallway. The gold seam in the cup will catch the light. And Elias mended, marked, unhidden will rise to meet it.